Welcome back to part 2 of the 4-part video series on comparative storytelling. The next natural thing to talk about after discussing characters are the relationships between the characters. Interestingly, the Eastern and Western philosophies regarding power are reversed for relationship dynamics. In Eastern stories, one is born into relationships. In Western stories, one chooses their relationships. In classical Confucian thought, there are 4 primary relationship dynamics, each with a senior, more powerful member and a junior, less powerful member. In the elder-younger brother dynamic, the elder brother is expected to look out for and protect the younger brother, while the younger brother is expected to treat the elder brother in return with obedience and respect. In a husband/wife dynamic, the husband is expected to protect and adore his wife, while the wife is expected to show fidelity and subservience in return. In a lord-subject dynamic, the lord is expected to care for his citizens, and the subjects are in turn supposed to treat the lord with reverence and respect. Finally, in this father-son dynamic, the father is expected to educate and support his son, while the son is expected to treat his father with filial piety and obedience. Side note, due to the patriarchal roots of this philosophy, these relationships mostly include male components. However, these can be expanded more generally to elder/younger sibling, spouse/spouse, lord/subject, and parent/child. Clearly, these are all relationships that one is born into, echoing the strong familial values of Confucian societies. Other relationships that one is not born into often evolve into one of these 4 dynamics. For example, friend-friend relationships evolve into sibling dynamics with seniority determined by age, or master-disciple relationships evolve into father-son dynamics. In the modern day, employer-employee relationships mimic lord/subject dynamics, and teacher-student relationships adopt a father-son dynamic. Indeed, a common Chinese idiom reflects this: "Be my teacher for one day, and I will serve you as my father for the rest of my life." In contrast, Western stories seem to emphasize the relationships that one chooses, such as that of friends, enemies, or lovers. Drama is interesting because relationships can be torn apart just as easily as they can be formed. Tension arises from the potential of a relationship being destroyed. Meanwhile, in Eastern drama, tension arises from the disagreements of individuals that must maintain a relationship with one another that they were born into. As a result, Western dramas tend to have far fewer characters than Eastern dramas, with much fewer relationships. This gives rise to the Eastern idea of the large family. Before the 20th century and modernization, East Asian societies placed enormous value on the family unit, often featuring many extended relatives all living within one home. 2 of the greatest works of literature in all of history, Dream of the Red Chamber and 100 Years of Solitude, both involve a large family and its stories. In Cao Xueqin's novel, the Jia family is an aristocratic, noble family that has many ties to the royal family. Similarly, in Gabriel Garcia Marquez's novel, 7 generations of the Buendia family are documented. On the surface, these 2 pieces of literature seem to have similar stances on family. However, the distinct Western and Eastern perspectives shine through upon closer investigation. In 100 Years of Solitude, the story operates as a chronicle of the stories of individual family members, with the family serving as the context in which the stories take place. In Dream of the Red Chamber, the family is the plot. A common misconception is that because of this focus on relationships one is born into, Eastern characters are incapable of exercising free will. However, it is this very cognitive dissonance between the expectation of upholding an ideal Confucian relationship and the character's own desires that drives the tension in the plot. Of course, after investigating differences in family philosophy in Western and Eastern literature, it only makes sense that we talk about romance. The 4 great love stories are Legend of the White Snake, Butterfly Lovers, Lady Mengjiang, and The Cowherd and the Weaver. In the Legend of the White Snake, Bai Suzhen, a 500-year-old white snake spirit, falls in love with the mortal man Xu Xian and must defy the prejudices human society has against spirits, all while grappling with the fact that her lover will only be able to live for a finite amount of time. In the Butterfly Lovers, a pair of scholars fall in love with each other at the Imperial Academy. But when the girl returns home, she gets betrothed to another man, leading her lover to die of grief. The girl then jumps into his grave as he is being buried, killing herself in the process. 2 butterflies emerge from the grave as a symbol of their love, hence the name Butterfly Lovers. In the namesake story of Lady Mengjiang, a woman travels to the northern border to find her husband that was sent to work on the construction of the Great Wall, only to find that he had died and had been buried into the foundations of the wall. Finally, The Cowherd and the Weaver is a love story in which a mortal cowherd is separated from his lover and a mortal weaver fairy by the gods. After begging to be reunited, the gods decide to let them meet once a year on a bridge of magpies on what is now the Qixi festival, the Chinese equivalent to Valentine's Day. All in all, pretty melancholic and heartbreaking stories. Nevertheless, the takeaway is that in Eastern love stories, characters arises from love, while in Western stories, love arises from characters. Another prominent feature of Eastern romance is the portrayal of love through language. In accordance with the traditional Confucian custom of not showing one's emotions, love is instead expressed through subtle metaphors and introspective longing. In fact, love is often expressed most strongly in the absence of it, such as in the case of Deng Tran Kong's poem Lament of the Soldier's Wife. Romantic feelings are characterized by when the person that is cared about is not there. You might notice the restraint in the language used by Deng. Because discussion of sex is perceived in Eastern societies as vulgar and crude, Eastern depictions of romance generally shy away from describing lust and physical desire, instead focusing on spiritual and emotional yearning. There are exceptions, of course, such as the Golden Lotus, a rare case in which sexuality is explicitly discussed. The most obvious characteristic of Western romance, as evident by the pictures, is the emphasis on desire. Either physical or emotional, Western romance is based upon the mutual passion shared by two individuals. This portrayal of love largely stems from the vivid description of characters' internal thoughts and feelings that is typical of a Western narrative. As in Jane Eyre, the focus of the romance between Mr. Rochester and Jane is on Jane's internal thoughts. Bronte relays Jane's doubts and desires through the aforementioned stream of consciousness ever present in Western stories. Romance is characterized by the thoughts of one or both of the characters, depending on the omniscience of the narrator, rather than the external behavior and subtlety of dialogue that Eastern love stories generally tend to use. On the note of romance, friendship is also characterized quite differently in Eastern and Western narratives. Obviously, the role of a friend serves the same purpose as someone to rely on and trust, but based on the main characters of Western and Eastern stories, it is apparent the differences in protagonist philosophy. Especially prevalent in modern Japanese media such as the Power Rangers or Sailor Moon, the five-man band trope has emerged as a prominent feature of Eastern storytelling. Even in Western productions such as Teen Titans and Avatar The Last Airbender, the five-man band trope has permeated popular culture as a staple of cartoons, animes, and animated shows. So what is the five-man band? As the name suggests, the five-man band trope is a common dynamic consisting of five protagonists with different skills, abilities, and personalities. The most common breakdown of the five-man band is the leader, the lancer, the heart, the smart/funny guy, and the big guy. The leader is pretty self-explanatory. They're the leader of the group and drive the main motivation of the group. Think Robin or Aang. The lancer serves as contrast to the leader in terms of personality and abilities. Think Raven or Zuko. The heart is the cohesive force of the team that intermediates conflict between the other four characters. Think Starfire or Katara. The smart/funny guy is, as the name implies, a character for comedic effect and or the brain of the team. Think Beast Boy or Sokka. Finally, the big guy is the physically robust, quote-unquote, bronze of the group and can be figuratively or literally tough. Think Cyborg or Toph. So where does this trope originate? Ultimately, the number 5 is typical of an alliance of some sorts in Chinese culture. Whether it be the 5 elements, the 5 mountain sword clans, or the 5 tiger generals, Chinese stories and taboos often incorporate the number 5 to signify a group of people, /characters, /clans, /things that are working together to accomplish a common task. The most notable of these 5-man bands in Chinese literature is certainly that of Sun Wukong's band in Journey to the West. Sun Wukong, the Monkey King, is obviously the leader, with powerful abilities and quick-witted plans. Zhu Bajie, the pig, falls into the role of lancer, serving as a contrast to Wukong as a lazy and sometimes cowardly disciple. Then, Tripitaka, the monk that initiated the journey in the first place, is naturally the heart, with his strict adherence to Buddhist principles of benevolence and restraint. Sha Wujing, the river demon, is the bronze of the team, stoically hauling the team's luggage on his broad shoulders as they journey to India. Finally, often forgotten is the little white horse that Tripitaka rides on, a transformed white dragon. Although he doesn't really do much throughout the story, he is undeniably a member of the band and contributes in some pretty significant ways in some subplots. In the comparable Western literary journey, The Odyssey, the idea of the team doesn't really exist. Sure, Odysseus has a crew of soldiers, but they mostly function as disposable metrics of imminent danger. Ultimately, what drives the story is Odysseus' own determination, intelligence, and strength. This leads to the idea of collectivism versus individualism. In Eastern stories such as Journey to the West, the story is driven by a group of people, often very many, and whether or not they succeed depends on their ability to work together as a cohesive unit. However, in Western stories, a more individualistic approach is adopted, testing the main protagonist's capabilities and perseverance over the course of several trials and tribulations. Even in a story with multiple main characters, change is often achieved through the individual efforts of characters rather than through the cooperation of many groups of people. For example, an Eastern story about restoring a rightful ruler to the throne would involve the protagonist delicately balancing the interests of different parties and gaining supporters for his or her movement. However, in a Western take on such a premise, the story would follow the ruler, him or herself, and their individual traits that lead up to a final showdown between him or herself and the unrightful ruler. As a result of the more collectivist mindset of Eastern societies, Eastern stories often have a much larger cast of characters than Western stories do. For example, one of the four great classics, Water Margin, follows the adventures of 108 outlaws and their endeavors to restore justice in a corrupt society facing both external and internal pressures. Each chapter or two of Water Margin focuses on one of these outlaws, detailing their part in the larger story of resisting the Liao invasion of the Song dynasty. Together, they collectively form a formidable force for change, becoming something larger than the sum of its parts. In East Asian culture, one is bound by a sense of duty and loyalty to several layers of allegiances. At the most basic level, one is obligated to his or her family and clan. The next level of loyalty is to one's tribe or city or military unit. Then it's loyalty to one's state or ethnicity. Finally, loyalty to one's country and emperor. Regardless of what the situation may be, a hierarchy of loyalties dictates the motivations and behavior of the characters. I should note that this culture of collectivism is difficult to grasp within the perspective of Western society, where we are taught to be fiercely independent and individualistic. Consequently, Westerners like ourselves often mischaracterize these layered loyalties as lack of free will or mob mentality, but it is important to remove ourselves from this ethnocentric lens and understand that this attitude is merely a matter of differing perspectives. Nietzsche makes the Western standpoint quite clear in this quote. The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. If you try it, you will be lonely often and sometimes frightened, but no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself. One interesting hypothesis I came across is that, due to the hilly and mountainous terrain of Greece, individuals were unable to partake in agriculture on a massive scale, instead needing to fend for themselves by taking on jobs such as pottery, fishing, or olive oil producing. Meanwhile, in the central plains of East Asia, the vast, flat, fertile land allowed for large fields that required social cohesion and individual cooperation in order to effectively harvest and cultivate. As a result, the societies of the West and the East henceforth became more individualistic and collectivist, respectively. And that concludes our discussion on relationships in this 4-part video series on comparative storytelling. Join us next time for a discussion on plot.